In 2011, she won the Italian government scholarship for 1 year, and she decided to write her doctoral dissertation about the genesis and development of the iconography of the last days of the Virgin Mary from the 13th century to the 15th century in Italy, under the guidance of Professor Andrea De Marchi here at Florence University. During the doctoral course, in 2014, she participated in a summer school about the reconstruction and restoration of the historic center of the city of L'Aquila. In the academic year 2016-2017, she received a fellowship from the Roberto Longhi Foundation, also here in Florence, to deepen her study about the wall paintings in L'Aquila. And after the defense of the doctoral thesis in 2008, she was awarded an international fellowship from NIKI, from our institute, for foreign postdocs, and from January to March 2019. So that's when we first met, and she has been visiting the institute many times since. From April 2019 to March 2022, she received a research fellowship for young scientists from the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science, which is quite prestigious, of course. And since April 2022, she obtained her position as assistant professor at Waseda University. One of the reasons why we have Natsuko here lecturing today is, of course, that this wonderful book has been published about the theme of the last days of the Virgin Mary. Very beautiful book. It's written in Japanese. Unfortunately for me and for many who are present here today. And so that's one of the reasons why we are so delighted that today you will give insight into your discoveries and your which came about during this the production of this beautiful thesis and this beautiful book. I'm not sure whether people from Japan will be able to follow us today because of the time difference. Yes, maybe your publisher. In any case, we're most delighted that you are able to share your insights today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for your beautiful presentation. Good evening, everyone. I'm Natsuko Kuwabara. Firstly, I'd like to thank the member of NIKI, Professor Quakenstein, Professor Vandersman, and Ilaria, and our special secretary Lex, to give me this amazing opportunity. This is my first time my first lecture in English, and I'm so excited. So thank you all for attendance. Firstly, I summarized some key points about the research of the iconographies of the last days of the Virgin Mary, and explain a short history of its acceptance in the spheres of the Roman Church and the Byzantine. Secondly, I focus on the case study, the fresco of the church in Muggia Vecchia near Trieste. Does someone visited the Muggia Vecchia? Yes, you, because from Trieste. Okay, now let's open my lecture. Wait a minute, excuse me. Okay, good. Introduction. My research aims to clarify the genesis, development, and functions of the iconographies concerning the last days of the Virgin Mary. The last days of the Virgin Mary is a series of episodes of the Virgin Mary's last days on earth, her death, and her glorification in heaven. This theme was a frequent subject of pictorial representation in the Mediterranean from the 9th century to the end of the 15th century. You might actually have seen the following artworks or photos of them: The Death of the Virgin by Caravaggio and The Assumption of the Virgin by Tiziano. There are actually a lot of artworks which present her last days and we are familiar with them. But for her death and Assumption, there is no canonical evidence. Acts of the Apostles 1:14 narrates about the apostles that after the ascension of Christ, all these devoted themselves with one accord to prayer, together with some women, and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his brothers. This is the last testimony about the Virgin, so we don't know when and where she died, and how and what happened after her death. But her last days became a popular subject for Christian art. How were these iconographies created, even if there is no canonical evidence? What is the importance of these iconographies? And what does this mean for the history of art? I will start my lecture with the moment of genesis of these iconographies. Since the Council of Ephesus declared the Virgin Mary the Mother of God in 431, her death and posthumous glory became a center of interest. Subsequently, a large number of apocrypha were produced. Of these, 63 texts still survive in 9 languages: Arabic, Armenian, Coptic, Ethiopic, Greek, Irish, Georgian, Latin, and Syriac. These languages are used in the Mediterranean. Therefore, the representation of the last days of the Virgin Mary must have spread in that area. Yet these accounts have substantially different endings to the Virgin's story. 1. Only her soul was elevated. 2. Soul and body were elevated together. And 3. Soul and body were elevated at 2 separate moments. Even though there was no orthodox approval with regard to these apocrypha, whenever one was accepted in a certain area and in a certain period, it was believed to be a true story. As that, there were some true stories about the Virgin's last days in each region and in each period, depending on which one of the apocrypha was accepted. For this reason, various iconographies of her last days were produced. By the time the dogma of her bodily assumption was recognized in 1950, about 1,500 years had passed after the Council of Ephesus. The various topics about the representation of the last days of the Virgin Mary had evolved alongside Christian history between East and West. Now, I will show you a brief history of the development and acceptance of the iconographies in the spheres of the Roman Church and Byzantium. Due to liturgical differences, the moment of her death was an often repeated theme in the Byzantine sphere. In the areas dominated by the Roman Church, meanwhile, a sequence of her last days was depicted. This is not an absolute binary opposition, but especially from the middle of the 12th century to the end of the 13th century, the two different tendencies existed. Since around the first half of the 10th century, the moment of her death had been repeatedly represented in the sphere of Byzantium, because in this period, the 12 great feasts of the Eastern Orthodox Church were determined, and one of these great feasts celebrates the death of the Virgin on the 15th August. Let's have a look at the iconography. Jesus Christ holds the Virgin Mary's soul and holds it up in order to deliver it to the flying angel. The Virgin's body lies on the bed, with the apostles surrounding it. Peter swings an incense burner. Paul touches the tips of the Virgin's toes, and John falls down near her breast. In technical terms, this iconography is called chemisches. Most probably, this scheme would not have existed before the 10th century. Due to iconoclasm, which occurred in 726 and ended in 843, almost all artworks which present the Virgin's last days were lost. The few extant examples present the event before and after her death. Now I will show you the three wall paintings. Arch Altu Kilisesi in Cappadocia, Turkey. Tokaru Kilise in Cappadocia, Turkey. And the monastery of the Syrians in Wadi el-Natun in Egypt. All of them present more than merely the moment of her death. Moreover, these iconographies are different from the chemisches. I will explain one case of these three artworks, the wall painting of the monasteries of Syrians. It exhibits the Virgin's dead body, the apostles, several women, and an angel. The angel doesn't have anything in his hand. So this scene would not be the moment of chemisches. This scene must be the moment of transfer of her body by the angel after the elevation of her soul. Actually, one Greek apocrypha, G1, narrates this event. Through the analysis of several extant examples, we can assume the existence of artworks which present a series of the last days of the Virgin Mary before iconoclasm. But after the 10th century, until the end of the 13th century, only chemisches has featured repeatedly in the sphere of Byzantine. In the sphere of the Roman Church, meanwhile, after the second half of the 8th century, the title of the festival on August 15th was changed from the death of the Virgin to the Assumption of the Virgin. For this reason, there was a possibility to allow for the representation of her posthumous glory, namely, not only the moment of her death, but also her glorification and her last days as a prelude to her triumph. After diplomatic and political contact with the marriage in 972 of Theophano, a Byzantine princess, and Emperor Otto II, the iconography of chemisches also migrated to the spheres of Roman Church. Soon, however, the artists tried to add particular motifs to suggest the events before and after her death. I will show you a capital of Clermont-Ferrand and a leaf from the Winchester Psalter. Both look like chemisches, but represent a vacant tomb that suggests her burial assumption. Around the middle of the 12th century, the sequence of the last days of the Virgin Mary was represented on an extensive scale based on an enthusiastic Marian devotion promoted by theologians such as Sugel, abbot of Saint Denis, and Bernard of Clairvaux. It was shown on the tympanum of the Cathedral of Senlis around 1170, and this program immediately spread to northern French cities. The burial of the Virgin is on left side on the lintel. The apostles seize the seat and bring down the body of the Virgin. The resuscitation of the Virgin is on right side of the lintel. The angel sees the seat or pull or push her body to elevate it. The coronation of the Virgin is above the lintel. The crowned Virgin sits on the throne with Christ. we can soon recognize a compositional contrast between burial and resuscitation. After this sculpture, when the apostles bring the Virgin's seat, this gesture designates the burial. And when the angels bring the Virgin's seat, this gesture designates the resuscitation. Therefore, the subject of Giotto's artwork is ambiguous because both angels and apostle touch her body, and it's not clear which moment is represented. As I said before, this program derived from the motif in Senlis, which spread in northern French cities after the middle of the 12th century. Interestingly, at the same time, the point of view on life and death changed. Philippe Aliès, a famous French medievalist, pointed out in his famous work, Essai sur l'histoire de la mort en Occident, that around the middle of the 12th century, the point of view on life and death changed from tamed death to one's own death, caused by change of lifestyle. Before the middle of the 12th century, people were living in small agricultural villages, especially in southern France. Around the middle of the 12th century, when urbanization progressed in northern France, many people left their farming community and moved to commercial and industrial cities. According to Philippe Aliès, this radical change caused the change of view of life and death. The last days of the Virgin was sculptured in cathedrals in northern French commercial cities as like Paris, Strasbourg, and Châteaux. The Marian iconographies would have been seen in the context of this change of view of life and death. Let's summarize the important points up to now. In the areas of Roman Church, the Virgin's bodily Assumption was celebrated. After the acceptance of Chymicius in the end of the 10th century, little by little the iconography of Chymicius experienced modification of the moments of before and after the actual event of the death of the Virgin. After the middle of the 12th century, the sequence of the last days of the Virgin Mary is represented on an extensive scale. In the sphere of Byzantium, meanwhile, a few extant artworks testify that there were examples which show the moment before and after the death of the Virgin. But after the formation of the 12 great feasts, only the moment of her death, Chymicius, is featured until the end of the 13th century. This is to say that at least from the middle of the 12th century to the end of the 13th century, this binary opposition existed. In the spheres of Roman Church, the last days of the last days and her bodily Assumption were depicted. In the spheres of Byzantium, only her death was pictured with iconography of Chymicius. Encounter of East and West, Muggia. Keeping in mind this temporary binary opposition, I want to analyze one Italian artwork. The fresco of the church of Muggia near Trieste. The fresco was painted around 1240. This is one of the oldest pictures in Italy, which represent the Marian last days. By the end of the 13th century, this version of the Marian last days was featured in basilicas of important Italian cities, San Francesco of Assisi, Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, a stained glass window of Cathedral of Siena. Moreover, this Marian theme was depicted in the apse, the most hierarchical space in a church. There are some reasons for its flourishing, such as the big success of the Golden Legend, edited by Dominican friar Jacobus de Volagine, which presents her Assumption's story. Franciscans' enthusiastic support for the notion of the Virgin's bodily Assumption. as also the Sienese people's ardent promotion of Siena as a Marian city after the miraculous victory over Florence in the War of Monteperti in 1260. But the fresco of Muggia Vecchia was depicted before the work of Jacobus de Voragine and the Franciscans' enthusiastic devotion for Mary's Assumption. Moreover, Muggia is not an important city like Assisi, Rome, or Siena, neither in a religious nor a political context. Why was one of the oldest Italian examples of the last days of the Virgin Mary produced in this small city, better said, in this small fishing village? And how were these iconographies chosen? Which kind of function were they expected to have? Let's look at inside of the church. On the northern wall of the central nave, there are 4 scenes of the last days of the Virgin Mary: death of the Virgin, funeral procession, burial, Assumption. Moreover, the martyrdom of Saint Stephen and Saint Florence is presented. On the southern wall, only 2 scenes are shown: Incredulity of Saint Thomas and Pentecost. Seeing the 4 scenes of the Marian cycle, we notice that the figure of her body is repeated 3 times, and the final scene, her body has vanished. The anonymous painter depicts only a vacant tomb and 3 people who indicate the tomb as a symbol for the Assumption. The inscription, Sepolcro Regina Coeli, means tomb of the Queen of Heaven. Only the cloth which wrapped Mary's body is left. First of all, I want to point out that the formation of cycle is a result of French influence. In northeastern Italy, until the middle of the 13th century, the sequence of the last days of the Virgin Mary was not represented. Around the same period, actually, we can find the other example of this cycle in the northwest of Italy, the rood screen of the Church of Santa Maria in Vezzolano, near Turin. There are burial, resuscitation, and coronation of the Virgin. These 3 iconographies are copied from the scheme of French cathedrals. Thus, the huge success of Saint Lis's program had an impact to production of wall painting in Muggia. But the iconography of Assumption in Muggia is completely different from the French iconography. In France, the Assumption is presented by the Virgin's awakened body. One angel pushes her back, the other pulls her hand and neck. But here, in Muggia, only a vacant tomb is frescoed. Therefore, the Muggia painter depicted the Marian cycle under the influence of French fashion, but at the same time didn't use the French iconography to represent the Assumption. So, how did he create this new iconography? This is a textual source for this iconography. Among the extant 63 apocrypha, one Greek apocrypha, which originated from the sermon of Johanni of Thessaloniki, is called G3. This apocrypha narrates her death, funeral procession, burial, and bodily Assumption. For the bodily Assumption, this Greek text testifies that when the apostles saw the tomb, it was vacant and only her clothes remained, and they noticed her bodily elevation. This Greek text was spread in the sphere of Byzantium, and because Muggia is located in the center between the Italian peninsula and the Balkan peninsula, the reception of this Greek apocrypha was possible. As a small city which adjoins the sphere of Byzantium, the painter would not have the courage to overtly demonstrate her bodily assumption, or he would be afraid to depict it explicitly. But using the Greek apocrypha, he could resolve this dilemma. This hypothesis will be clear through the reconstruction of the Christian cycle. Without the incredulity of St. Thomas and Pentecost, no one was able to reconstruct the pictorial program of the southern wall because of the heavy damage. Both the incredulity of St. Thomas and Pentecost are the episodes after the resuscitation of Christ. Therefore, there would be 4 scenes about the story after the Passion of Christ, opposite to the Marian last days on the northern wall. Meanwhile, opposite to the 2 martyrdom scenes of the northern wall, there would have been 2 scenes of the Passion of Christ. It's quite difficult to reconstruct these 2 passion scenes, but for the stories after that, it is possible, because next to the incredulity of St. Thomas, there is a fragment, and by looking at which, we can reconstruct which subject was depicted. Let's look at this fragment. We see the rugged ground, and there are 2 or 3 white flowers. There are flowers. That means this is the terrestrial scene. This scene must be a subject which is even after the Passion and before the incredulity of St. Thomas. Now there are 2 candidates. The 3 Marys at the tomb, that means 3 women discover the vacant tomb, and Norimetangere, reunion of Christ and Mary Magdalene. So which subject is depicted here? We need to look at the broader area which had a cultural impact on Muggia, Trieste, and Venice. In Trieste, there is a church of San Giusto, and the chapel dedicated to this saint presents 2 scenes after the Passion, even if this chapel was dedicated to veneration of Saint Giusto. 3 Marys at the tomb here, and the incredulity of St. Thomas. We understand that these 2 subjects were highly regarded in Trieste Church. Moreover, some preceding studies pointed out the stylistic similarity between frescoes of Muggia and frescoes of Trieste, and both wall paintings were created around 1240. In Venice, the Passion and resuscitation are shown on the arch of the Basilica of San Marco, produced early in the 13th century. After the crucifixion, there is a 3 Marys at the tomb at the center of the arch. The next scene is descent into hell. That means Christ's bride brought salvation to the good souls held captive there. And beneath this subject, Norimetangere and the incredulity of St. Thomas are represented. Here, the subject, 3 Marys at the tomb, is shown at the center to underline the triumph of Christ against death. Both frescoes of San Giusto in Trieste and the mosaics of San Marco in Venice feature 3 Marys at tomb. Therefore, we can presume that this subject, 3 Marys at tomb, would be frescoed in Muggia Vecchia as the fragmental scene. In the sphere of Byzantium, the resuscitation of Christ is not clearly depicted. If you are used to seeing Renaissance art, when you hear resuscitation of Christ, maybe you imagine the moment which Christ stands up from the tomb, as in the wall painting of Piero della Francesca. But in the sphere of Byzantium, the moment of his resuscitation is suggested by the descent into hell and the 3 Marys at the tomb. Therefore, I guess that the former scene of the 3 Marys at the tomb in Muggia would be the descent into hell. Both Marian cycle and the Christian cycle don't describe clearly the moment of resuscitation according to the Byzantine tradition. The correspondence of the northern wall and the southern wall is testified by the presence of a pulpit which has two lecterns. According to the study of Laudanazzi and Annarita Cardet, the former lectern, which turns towards south, was used for sermons held in the direction of the southern wall. The latter lectern, which turns towards east, was used for the sermons held in the direction of the northern wall. As a Roman Catholic tradition, the southern wall is called as Column Epistulae, that means the side of apostolic epistle, and the northern wall is called as Column Evangelii, that means the side of gospel, because the northern area is the darkest area in the church, so it needs the light of the gospel, the word of God. The presence of the pulpit reinforces the correspondence between the Marian cycle and the Christian cycle. Finally, we must ask how the last days of the Virgin Mary was received in Muggia and what kind of function was expected. To resolve this problem, I want to call your attention to an enigmatic image in the church. The three saints with jar interspersed among the naves. According to Marcel Angevin, these images are metaphors of the wise virgins which are assimilated Christian saints. Two inscriptions, Caterina Sant'Agnese, these two inscriptions on their side testify that they are Saint Catherine and Saint Agnes, even if they usually not have a jar as their attribute. These three are Christian saints assimilated with wise virgins. So wise virgins are motives which derived from the parable of Christ. According to Matthew 25, from 1 to 13, the virgins await a bridegroom. Five wise virgins had brought enough oil for their lamps for the wait. The other foolish five didn't prepare enough oil. The five virgins who had prepared for the bridegroom's arrival are rewarded, while the five who went to buy further oil miss the bridegroom's arrival and are disowned. The iconography of the wise and foolish virgins is the typology of the Last Judgment, and this motif is repeatedly depicted in northeastern Italy. Therefore, the pictorial program of Muggia Vecchia was integrated in the eschatological context and asks us to think about our life and death. The southern wall presents the Passion and Christ's victory against death. The Virgin's body elevation is accomplished by Christ's sacrifice and victory against death. And like the Virgin entered heaven, all good souls can enter heaven after Last Judgment. Therefore, the last days of the Virgin Mary is a typology for good souls. But now, I'd like to do more analysis. The representation of the last days of the Virgin Mary was integrated in the eschatological context in Muggia and needs to ask us to think about our life and death. This attitude is similar to the background of the reception of a sequence of the Marian last days in northern France, which accepted one's own death caused by the change of view on life and death. But Muggia is a small fishing village. Therefore, the circumstances were totally different from the commercial and industrial northern French cities. Muggia's people would not die their own death. They would die a tamed death. to testify to the view on life and death of Muggia's people, a figure of Christopholos is frescoed on the right nave. This image functioned as a talisman, and from the beginning of the 13th century, this figure had been repeatedly shown in the northeastern area in Italy. Beneath this image, there is an inscription. Those who meditate his figure as a daily task won't take every enunciation. Keeping in mind this image, now let's look at the wall painting in the right nave. There are the fragments of the Storm of the Sea of Galilee and Pilgrimage of Saint Ursula. Both of them present marine episodes. The decoration of the right nave presents a daily prayer for Muggia's people, asking for protection against disaster at sea. Therefore, the enunciation written beneath the figure of Christopholos means drowning. Moreover, this daily prayer doesn't close in the right nave. The fourth pilaster of the central nave depicts the figure of Saint Zeno, who is a patron saint for fishermen. Because this saint is shown on the central nave, the daily prayer of Muggia's people might be connected with the pictorial program of the central nave, which presents the last days of the Virgin Mary and the Passion of Christ and his victory over death. This whole pictorial program of the Church of Muggia Vecchia presents the prayer for eternal life after death and a prayer for protection against disaster at sea were compatible here. Muggia's people prayed to Christopholos to avoid unexpected death at the sea. They might be afraid of sudden death, but they would not be afraid of a natural death. According to Arias, this is the attitude of tamed death. I conclude that the French program was depicted by French urban people who died their own death, but one of the oldest artworks of the last days of the Virgin Mary in Italy, received by Muggia's people who died a tamed death. Closing. Today, I focus on the wall painting of Muggia Vecchia and explained its iconography of the Assumption, its textual source, and its expected function. As a textual source, I presented the Greek Apocrypha, but before to close my lecture, I'd like to underline the importance and influence of the Apocrypha after the 13th century. After the success of the Golden Legend of the Jacobus de Voragine, its story of Assumption became a fundamental textual source for iconographies of the last days of the Virgin Mary. I would like to point out that the story of Assumption in Golden Legend was composed by 4 Apocrypha: the Latin Apocrypha, also known as the Gospels of Pseudo-Melito L1, and the Greek Apocrypha, based on sermons of Cosmas Vestitor G13, and Greek Apocrypha, based on the sermons of Gedman of Constantinople G12, and the Greek Apocrypha, based on sermons of Johann of Damascus G11. Moreover, Jacobus de Voragine slightly modified the original Apocrypha, so in order to indicate the textual source for the iconographies, we have to pay attention to which text was used. As it is, the influence of the Apocrypha also continued after the end of the 13th century. For example, let me show you the apse mosaic of the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, produced by Jacopo Torriti. Here, Christ holds the soul of Virgin and her soul close to her head to Christ's breast. This expression is derived from the text of the golden legend based on L1. Meanwhile, we can recognize the figure of the ancestors of the Old Testament. At the left end, there is an inscription, D, and he is crowned, so he must be David. As Alessandro Tonei pointed out, one Greek apocrypha, G2, testifies that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and David accompanied the Virgin's dead body. Therefore, the textual source must be the Greek one. Thus, to depict this scene, not only the golden legend, but also this Greek one was used. The most famous example of the last days of the Virgin Mary must be the panel of Maestà by Duccio in Siena. Here I will show you only one panel, the Annunciation of the death of the Virgin. The lonely Virgin encounters an angel bearing a palm tree. As Roberto Guerini says, the lonely Virgin in the house is derived from the Latin Apocrypha L1. But the representation of the palm tree doesn't agree with this apocrypha because this text testifies that the palm tree emits huge light. Meanwhile, the text of Golden Legend based on L1 narrates that the palm tree only had some sparkles like the morning stars. Duccio carefully pictured 7 stars shining in the palm tree. Thus, he used both Latin Apocrypha and Golden Legend to depict this scene. Now time is running out, so I can show you only 2 artworks, but these examples testify to the continuous influence of Apocrypha after the end of the 13th century. Text is important to the creation of all kinds of iconographies, but in the case of the Marian last days, because of the lack of the Orthodox text, the problem is more complicated. Moreover, sometimes a misunderstanding of the motif occurred. But correlation between text and iconographies has continued after the Renaissance period too. To close my lecture, finally, let me show you 3 artworks. A copper plate print, which was ordered by Geronimo Nadal, and an altarpiece of Rubens for the Antwerp Cathedral, now Hermitage Museum, and Chinese copy of the Book of Nadal. Those altarpieces of Rubens and Chinese copy were depicted based on the work of Nadal. Nadal's inscription and image provided an idea for them, but this Chinese copy's inscription is slightly modified from the Nadal's explanation, and its change influenced the iconography. This complicated but fascinating problem around the iconographies of the last days of the Virgin Mary and its texts are not limited to the medieval Mediterranean world, but traveled all the way to Asia in a period of Counter-Reformation. And thank you so much for your attention.